Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the West Philadelphia Seventh-day Adventist Church. And let's try this again for a Sabbath afternoon. And let's see if introducing myself will cause me to be knocked off air as before. I hope not. For those of you that I haven't had the privilege of meeting, it is my pleasure to introduce myself to you. My name is W. Nick Taliaferro, and I happen to be the pastor of the finest worshiping congregation this side of heaven, the West Philadelphia Seventh-day Adventist Church. For those of you who've never visited us in person, we invite you to join us as soon as our doors are open again after the pandemic has passed. We're located at 46 and Haverford Street. We've been there for decades now, serving the West Philadelphia Mill Creek, Mantua community, and we do it with joy and with vigor. And we're hoping that one day you'll stop by to take me up on the offer to test the theory. If we're really the finest worshiping congregation this side of heaven, I hope that I'll see you one day soon, and you can let me know if you think that I'm telling you the truth. I know that I am. Well, this is our final Sabbath for Black History Month, and we celebrate all month long the triumphs and the journey of people of the African diaspora. The West Philadelphia Church really enjoys that rich heritage, inasmuch as at our church we have members of the African diaspora from so many different countries: South America, the Caribbean, the United States of America, Africa. We have members from everywhere at our church, and so it gives us the opportunity to look at the situation, the conditions, the circumstances surrounding Africans from all across the world, from a variety of perspectives. And that rich assortment of perspectives allows us to appreciate even more the grace of God and how the grace of God lifted this people out of the foul miasma of slavery. We want to thank our guest who joined us this Sabbath morning to speak to us at our worship service. Dr. Calvin Rock is a man with a distinguished history and resume. I won't give it all to you, but I will share this with you. Having served this church for decades, more than a half century, he still continues to serve, and one of his greatest gifts on his tool belt is his grasp of history and his ability to translate that history into what needs to be done for Black people in our current situation. The book that he has written concerning progress and protest of African Americans is sort of a manual for the next steps that we need to take to enhance our position and to maximize the potential that God has given to us. Before we go any further, we want to extend a welcome from the Board of Elders of the West Philadelphia Church, and we want to thank our youth ministries department of our church, because typically this would be their time. But the Board of Elders on a regular basis has a forum in the afternoon that allows us to address some of the more difficult situations and some of the more, shall we say, interesting portions of doctrine and biblical understanding. And today is one of those forums. And so we thank our elders. The West Philadelphia Church is served by, I think, the finest board of elders to be found anywhere in this nation, under the direction of our first elder, Elder David Gordon. And so we appreciate the fact that they have brought us together for this occasion and have invited our guest, Dr. Calvin Rock. Dr. Rock is the former president of Oakwood College, at the time Oakwood University presently, and also a former general vice president of the Seventh-day Adventist Church Worldwide and former board chair of Loma Linda University. But more than that, Dr. Rock is a shining example of what it means to be a Christian man, a Christian Black man, a Christian gentleman. And we are grateful that we have him before us today to lead us into further study about the African American condition and about what needs to be done in our church to advance that condition. So without any further words from myself, let's have a brief word of prayer. We'll begin, and then our speaker will come before you, and we will continue into our program as the Spirit leads. Let us pray. Eternal God, for this day that is given to us for rest, for body, soul, and spirit, we give you thanks. We yield ourselves to you. We pray now that as we are being refreshed in body, that you would refresh us in heart and in mind. Speak through your servant, so that through him you might make us aware of those things that pertain to our peace and our progress. Grant now that all that we do and say would be found within the economy of your will for us. And as we give ourselves over to you, flood every waiting heart with your presence. In the name of the living Christ we pray. Amen and amen. And now, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, it is my privilege to present to you once again the leader of our discussion for this afternoon and our speaker for this morning's service, Dr. Calvin B. Rock. Dr. Rock, the floor and the time is yours.
Thank you very much, Pastor Taliaferro. You bring great joy to my heart. I affectionately call you and quite a number of other ministers who came through as students when I was president at Oakwood, my boys. Hope you don't mind that.
Hey, I am honored and I revere that.
Maybe I should say my sons. Of course, as you said this morning, I have 3 lovely daughters of my biological production. But of course, you and all these others are adopted into a wide ring of ministers of whom I am immensely proud. And you, sir, are up there among the very of whose life I touched. So you up to good work. And thank you for the invitation. What I'd like to do, and I hope this fits in with what your elders would also prefer, is to go through a brief overview of the book. And the book is Protest and Progress. And it details very, very much like an overview of the 4 major protests of Black Seventh-day Adventists. Now, it must be remembered that Seventh-day Adventists are not the same as one of the major Black denominations, such as the AME, CME, the various Baptist conventions, and Pentecostal, and other Black-run denominations. Seventh-day Adventists are among the 15% of Black Protestants who are a part of what is known as an integrated denomination. 59% of the 78% of Black Americans who are Christians, 59% belong to the all Black denominations. And those all Black denominations, like the AME, CME, so forth, really don't have an internal problem as far as social justice is concerned. They're Black, and that's who they are. So they don't have an internal struggle. But Seventh-day Adventists, as many Methodists or 1 or 2 Methodist denominations and others who have also been involved in, and there are various denominations or various venues of the Black church so named in that pod of churches that are integrated, have a dual struggle, a dual challenge. They must not only be mindful of their place in the desegregated denomination where they belong, but they must also be involved in the community. And that, of course, is not always easy. And with the Seventh-day Adventists, it has produced some interesting vibes and events. And I'd like to run through them quickly and then take your questions. And not only your questions that might be brought to bear from what I say in this overview, but the questions you have sent. So I hope that's okay. I hope that's all right. And Even if it's not, that's what I planned. So let's launch into it. The first slide that I'd like to show you, which is a slide that introduces us to the book. And by the way, good pastor, I hope that I know you have the book. I don't know whether you have it nearby. So I'm going to hold up my copy. This
Isn't that exciting? You know, he's getting ready to hold up a copy of the book, and all of a sudden, we have lost Dr. Calvin Rock. I am hoping that we find him soon because I don't want to go down in history as the man who disappeared, the beloved former president of Oakwood College Church. The book is available through a variety of sources. You can also find it in Amazon, and as soon as he holds it up and shares that with you, I am hoping that we will be able to get a variety of folks to go out and get the book. Now, one of the things that I plan to do is later on in the year is to use it as a study guide, perhaps for prayer meeting, maybe even for Sabbath afternoon, especially as the days get longer, because we are hoping that the book makes for the kind of ongoing study and research that would be helpful in charting a course for the African American church. Now, I don't know whether you know this, but and it's sort of half humorous right now, but there is a movement afoot to consider the creation of the African American Adventist denomination, the AAAD, the African American Adventist denomination. And although it started off as a somewhat humorous discussion, it is starting to gather some strength. A lot of people feel that creating anything along racial lines speaks to the racism that is an entrenched part of American life. But the truth be told, setting up an administrative structure is not a replication of racism. It is simply a statement for efficiency in management. I'm pretty sure that Dr. Rock will share with you when we get back to him how once we were able to focus our energies as an African American group of Christians, we were able to do ministry more effectively to African American communities. It's just like other groups. When they come together and focus on those issues that are unique to themselves, it allows them to be more efficient in their operations. And a lot of people are beginning to think that that might be helpful for the African American church in particular. But one of the other issues that we come up with that we have to address is this: that the African American church, or as we used to call it, the black church, is more than just African American. For example, the West Philadelphia church is not majority African American. It is majority black, but not majority African American. It is a mix of people from a variety of different cultures, different nations, and we're discovering that black in America doesn't mean what it used to mean. And so we're wondering whether or not we need to rethink those things. Well, folks, without any further ado from yours truly, we are prepared to return to our speaker who, when he reached for that book, the devil said, I don't want folks to see this book, but we say the devil is a liar. And now back to Dr. Rock.
Okay, you see the first slide there, do you not? Are you hearing me, Pastor? Hello? I can't hear you.
Ask him if he's seeing the slide.
Do you see the slide and can you hear me?
Okay, I stopped sharing. I'm gonna have to end this. And
Hello? Can you see me? Can you hear me?
end the show.
Am I muted? Hello? Pastor, can you hear me? Am I muted?
You're not muted.
I'm unmuted, so
We can hear you.
I don't hear you. Are you muted?
We can hear you.
You can hear me.
Yes.
And how is it?
So let's proceed. But the pastor,
I'm sharing the screen.
we're going to share the screen, but if this doesn't work, can you hear me now? I'm sorry, but I'll proceed as if you can hear me. I'm really not sure.
You want me to just stop sharing? They're not talking back, so.
Can you hear me? Sister McFarland, can you hear me?
Okay, I stopped sharing. I'm gonna go back here. There you are.
Okay, are we on together now?
No. It says it's live.
You are
He said we
in.
can hear you. You are fine.
I'm fine?
Yes, go ahead.
All right.
So I'm going to share.
The slide. Hope. And I'm going to talk with the next slide. This one simply introduces the book. Let's go to the next slide, where it says that the book is an overview of the four major attempts of Black Seventh-day Adventists. And I've explained that Black Seventh-day Adventists are part of a desegregated church, and it has issues that the big black denominations do not have. Next slide. And one of the issues is tied to the U.S. government and its history. On the left side of this particular slide, you see 5 major periods in the nation's history. First is slavery, 1619 to 1865. Then is the recovery of the South. After slavery, it took another 30 years or so for them to recover, but they recovered. And in 1896, they recovered from the Civil War defeat. And by 1896, they were able to get separate but equal passed, which wasn't slavery, but it was the next best thing as far as they were concerned. And that lasted, third part shows, from 1896 to 1954. At that time, I was a young man, 24 years of age, so I saw separate but equal for the first quarter of my life anyway. Now, after that, the fourth part, the civil rights movement from 54 to 68, which I witnessed, was a part of. If we have time, I'll give you a few stories there. And after that was what I have chosen to call justice de jure, which means that all the bills and laws that were given during the civil rights movement and since are de jure. That is, they're in the books. They're not de facto, meaning that all of them are being acted out properly, but they are there. Now, on the other side, on the right-hand side, I show how the Seventh-day Adventist Church at least reacted to these various periods. In period 1, during slavery, the pre-Adventist, the Adventist Church didn't really get started until 1863, 1865, but the pre-Adventists were very much anti-slavery. And the early pioneers who took over the church were anti-segregation. And there are lots of quotes and records that show that. Then in the third pod, during separate but equal, the church retreated to a gospel of expediency, they called it. Didn't have many black members during this time. In fact, by 1900, there were only 100 Black Seventh-day Adventists. But during the heyday of separate but equal, the white leadership felt, and they were right in a practical way, that if they let blacks into their churches and schools, white people wouldn't come. So they couldn't do any evangelism and effective witness. And so they adopted what was called the gospel of expediency. And the gospel of expediency, or gospel expediency, said, you don't come in to our churches and schools and hospitals, because if you do, white folk won't come. And the government said separate but equal, so it's against the law anyway. And that position by the church prevailed during the third period, and it prevailed to a large degree during the fourth period, even though the civil rights movement, as indicated on the left-hand side, lasted until 1968, and in 1954, the government repealed and annulled separate but equal and said it's no longer the law. The church held on to it. And the first definitive statement by the Seventh-day Adventist Church, most other churches made their statements before ours. But 11 years after separate but equal was annulled, we finally came out with a statement that said all Adventist institutions, Seventh-day Adventist institutions, must be integrated or should be integrated. And after that, the civil rights movement had ended about that time in 1968. The struggle continued in the church, and even until the year 2000, there were aftermath occasions and encounters where Black members had to go to extraneous means and methods in order to be fully recognized. So that shows on the right-hand side the nature of the battle. Now, let's look at some of these protests. This fourth slide shows that there were 4 protests. The first protest was for full integration, full participation. And you remember on the slide that we just finished, the gospel of expediency was there. So full participation was denied because the church felt it had to go along with what the government prescribed. And the second protest is indicated, the push for colored conferences followed once the Black brothers found out, and sisters, but of course the ministers were primarily men, once they found out that they couldn't get in to the white churches and the white conferences and white leadership and direction of the work, they said, well, give us our own conferences. And that was the second push. And it culminated in 1944 when the president of the General Conference, a man named Elder McElhaney, called the Black brothers together and said, now, we want you to have your conferences. A lot of people think that we got the Black conferences, now called regional conferences, because we were knocking at the door and we took off our shoes like Khrushchev and beat on the table. No, no, no. They asked for it. They prayed for it. They made a petition. They made a petition in 1929 and they were denied. But in 1944, events in society and in the church, including the death of Lucille Bayard in 1943, who tried to get into Washington Adventist Sanitarium, was rejected and died several weeks later in the Black hospital, had stirred up so much protest among lay groups and members that the brethren said, well, why don't you have your Black conferences? It'll be the best way to approach the mission of the church. And that's when we got Black conferences in 1943-44. Then the fourth or the third protest was the push for Black unions, when a lot of ministers in the field and the Black conference presidents got together and said, we want to get all of these different conferences we now have and put them into 2 unions so that we don't have to be involved in the state unions or the current unions at that time. And by the way, they still exist because this particular protest was denied. But they felt that the membership had grown and the needs had grown to the point where the Black local conferences that we still have could have and should have been put into unions, and that would facilitate the mobility, lateral and vertical, of the Black officials in the local conferences and their presence in the division and in the General Conference, which it would have done. But that protest was denied. The fourth protest was for equal or equitable retirement. the black brothers felt that even though they were paying in the same amount of money into the retirement fund and their checks upon retirement were the same, that it still wasn't equal, because the white brethren lived longer to enjoy those retirement benefits. And when they retired with cushion from intergenerational wealth that blacks didn't have. So they pushed for a separate retirement system, and they got it. So protest number one failed. Protest number two, colored conferences, succeeded. Protest number three failed. Protest number four succeeded. And that's, in a nutshell, is the story of the book. Now, we have other slides, but I'm going to move through quickly so I can get to your questions. But I'll try to illustrate how those protests went about, or how they went down, as we sometimes say. And here we have is the push for full participation. And you see the denials. Blacks in the church were denied membership, admission, hiring, and so forth, equal pay. And that just didn't work. The result of that was that from 1896 to 1965, which was the period from the beginning of separate but equal to the time that the Adventist Church, Seventh-day Adventist Church, came out with an overt appeal to all of its churches: open your doors and everybody be fair with hiring and so forth. A lot of discouragement of colored members. There was a lot of discouragement of potential members who said, well, these people are prejudiced, this Adventist church. There was a defection of a lot of colored leaders, a lack of physical and intellectual talent was wasted. So that was unfortunate. We had individual protests, one from a man named Kinney, who's known as the father of Black Adventist ministry, the first black preacher ordained in 1898. Another, Louis Sheaf, famous lawyer in the Washington, D.C. area, who became an Adventist minister and talked to Ellen White about the situation, as was with James Howard, a physician in the D.C. area, and J.K. Humphrey in New York, perhaps the most famous of all the individual protesters. And as the next slide shows, others were involved. John and Charles Manns in Savannah, Georgia. Sheaf left the church and began his own. And the Manns brothers started their own Adventist church. They started their own Adventist church. Sheaf started his. Humphrey started his. And Bontemps, who was one of the Harlem Renaissance authors and perhaps the most famous author in Black Adventism, wonderful Christian brother, but he became discouraged after several incidents. And by the way, part of that was because he was around when the students were rioting at Oakwood in the early 30s, pleading for Black leadership. Until then, they had Black presidents since 1896, but they wanted a white president. I'm sorry. They called them directors, but they wanted a Black president, and they got one. But the brethren blamed Bontemps for being involved with the students in that endeavor, and he got discouraged, and he left the church, and that was unfortunate. So there were appeals in 1909, appeal in 1918, and they were turned down. But the second period, and that began in 29 with the first formal appeal, and it ended in 44 when the conferences were granted or offered. But as you see, these are the dates of the early and the functional appeal. Now, there were certain precipitating events. One was the growth of the church, had only about 3,500 in 1918, and by 1944, 17,000. When the Black conferences were organized, 17,700 or 900 members. So all of that told the brethren in the General Conference and the Black brothers, along with the Lucille Bayard event and government legislation that was going on, and some some push from a black layman's group in the Washington area after the death of Lucille Byard, who died there in D.C. That's when the General Conference came together and said, hey, you better go ahead and get your regional conferences. And the organization was launched in 1944. 1943, 44, the West Coast was involved in the discussions, but decided for various reasons, and the book tries to detail some of them, it was better not to do it out here where I live now and where I grew up as a young man. My mother moved from New York when I was 11 to LA, to Los Angeles when in 1941, right just before World War II began. We moved to the coast in 41. In September, the war began in December. So I was aware as I was growing up somewhat of the debate and could tell you more about that. And in the book, it's detailed to some extent. But here are the dates of the birth of the conferences. Lake Region, office in Chicago. Allegheny East, your conference, with headquarters in Pottstown. Northeastern headquarters in New York, South Atlantic, and so forth. All of the dates. And the baby conference, the Southeastern, down in Florida. Now, the Black Union debate began in 1969 with an appeal that, as I've already explained, was precipitated by events, the growth in the Black conferences and events in society. And there was an appeal in 69, an appeal in 70, an appeal in 1976. And it was not only the Black brothers trying to debate with the white superstructure, the Black brothers themselves were divided. Those who wanted Black unions, I call the self-determinationists. And you see three of the leading names: Elder Bradford, Elder Cleveland, Elder Dudley. On the other side, we call the integrationists, those who wanted to hang in and not have these Black unions, which some Black brothers felt were pulling away too far from the white brothers and sisters in the church, were Banfield, Canson, and Hale. Now, Frank Hale later changed his mind and he joined in with the self-determinationists. But for most of the struggle, in those dates that I've already quickly reviewed, he was on this side of the ledger. And in the book, you see how their various approaches are detailed. Won't go through that now, but it was a great time for study and for learning. Now, there were a number of significant events or dates. As again, 1977, Pricksad said no. 1978, Pricksad said no. And the Black brothers came out with a book called Together for Finished Work and went around all the Black churches preaching and trying to get this Black union going. But again, even after a big debate was outlined in the review in 1978, there was a negative vote in that same year. And even after the negative vote, we didn't want to give up. I say we because I was one of those Black union advocates. And we decided we would get what we call territorial councils, which would have been quasi-Black unions. And we had it all lined up as to who and how, but we finally let it go. One reason is that Elder Bradford, by that time, had been elected as the president, the first Black president of the North American Division, and we didn't want to fight him, who had been one of our main advocates, and we wanted to let him get his feet wet, as you say, or get started as the division president before we went any further. And by that time, some other good things were happening, a lot of which are attributable to his leadership. We began to get Black leaders in unions where we hadn't had them before, and a lot of presidents at the GC or General Conference. So the Black union debate lost its steam, and we moved on from there. And the final push was a push for equitable retirement, and the brethren had several ideas about that. They said, look, even though we put the same amount of money in and get the same amount of money out, we don't live as long as these white brothers. And as I said this morning, white men live on the average 6 years longer than black men. So they said, look, why should we put our money in and then we die and they live off of what we put in? It's not right. We need to give some money while we're alive. The other part, another thing that they argued was that the white brothers, when they retired, had more goods to fall back on. The black brothers didn't have any investments. They didn't have parents who left them real estate and houses and money in the bank. So they said, look, we don't have their liquid assets. We don't live as long. And they had other reasons that I won't try to detail now. But those are 2 or 3 of the main ones. So let's get our own retirement. And they fought for it. 1998, there was a caucus. 1998, there was a meeting with the black presidents and the North American division. The first one was just among the blacks. 1999, they engaged in independent study, and they met with the General Conference president in the year 2000. And I'll tell you this little vignette, and then I'm done. Well, I do have a conclusion, but let me give you this. They walked into the president's office, Elder John Paulson, and he asked them, what are you going to do if we say no? And one of the brothers, President Niles, at that time of the Lake Region Conference, said, Mr. President, only 3 things you can do. If you're on a bus and it's going the wrong direction, and you either keep going in the wrong direction, and you know you're in the wrong direction, or you turn around and go back to where you came from, which you don't like in the first place, didn't like in the first place, or you get off the bus. And that was a very ominous statement. And with that, the brethren said, well, we'd better be careful here. And so they softened their approach, got a further study in 2000, and by the end of 2000, the black brothers who had engaged Mutual of Omaha Life Insurance, Mutual of America Life Insurance Company, were able to get their own insurance, and today they have $350 million in reserve, over 800 people on the system, and it's working beautifully. A lot of the white conferences wish they could get in on it. But it succeeded, and that's the main thing I want to say. Now, the next part of the book, the final part of the book is, what do we do from here on? What's the next protest? My thought is that we don't need any more protests. We need to get together like that on racial issues. We got enough money, enough power. But what do we do? Well, shall we get rid of these regional conferences? Yes or no? My answer is no. Some people say, well, what about the principle of unity? Fine, but unity is not unison. We are unified, we blacks in this desegregated church. We're unified with our white brothers in doctrine. We believe the same Sabbath, second coming, sanctuary. Well, we're unified. So we're not homogenized. We are a group that has unity in diversity. Segregated? No, the conferences aren't segregated. Segregation says you can't come in. But nobody says that. Anybody can belong to a regional conference, and we blacks can belong to any of the state conferences. So there's no segregation. It's just a selection as to where your religious impulses carry you, and that's fine. Regional conferences are duplication. They're not a duplication of what we most are about getting into, and that is culture. And therefore, we're not a duplication of finance and energy. It may be a duplication of territory, but that's not anybody's fault. It just happens that in these states where both conferences are operating, you have vastly differing cultures that must be approached with vastly different philosophies and methodologies. And some people say, well, we're living in a post-racial colorblind society. Oh, really? Were you looking at the television on January 6th? Do you believe we're in a colorblind Post-racial society? I don't think so. And there are other kinds of arguments, like the one at the bottom of the slide that says there'll be no separate conferences, no separate black conferences in heaven, black and white. No, there'll be no conferences in heaven. So we don't have to worry about that. We'll be in a different situation with no different cultures to evangelize. And there are other arguments that I shan't take time to go through now. But marching on, let me show you that since black conferences were organized in 1944, we now have gone from 17 or 18,000, you might as well say, all the way up to over 400,000. We've even increased since this time that the slides indicate. And our tithe has moved from 500,000, it should say, all the way up to beyond 184 million. We now have approximately $326 million tithe every year. And that is the beauty of regional conferences. When we started, we were 7% of the church. Now, we're over 30%. The latest statistics show we are 33% of the world church. So that the Lord is blessed in a marvelous way. And these conferences are not a thirst for power, not retaliation or pride. It's a matter of indigenous leadership. Indigenous meaning people from the hood, people from the community, people from the culture, working with people who understand them, and not alien leadership. Indigenous leadership is always more effective than alien leadership, and white leadership in a lot of black communities where I have pastored is alien. They don't understand. The people would resist, but black, and remember, the pastor is not just pastoring the congregation assigned by the conference. The pastor is to serve the whole community. And serving the whole community means you need envoys, you need missionaries, you need pastors and workers who are indigenous, if possible. Indigenous leadership is always better than alien. And that's the basic philosophy. It's all about mission. So what are we looking for the future? As far as this poor preacher is concerned, what we need to do is get our act together. The relationship of black Americans, Africans, Caribbean, Haitians, everybody who's black, all of us who have black blood, we need to get together, pool our money, pool our powers, pool our resources, and work to build church schools. That's our need. The great need we have now is not when do we have a black General Conference president. Blacks in America are only 2% of the world church. So we have no reason to say we are being overlooked. 2%. The other 98%, they like to have a black GC president and probably deserve one more than we do. But so we've got enough people in big places. We now have had 2 presidents of the North American division. That's great. That's great. We have one now. But our problem is that we're losing young people and we're losing a lot of mature adults because we don't have Christian education where their children can be nurtured and developed. And the next major protest, I feel, might very well not involve racial freedoms and authority. I think we're past that. More likely, it should include vigorous attempts to improve relational issues within the black community, as well as initiatives for education and the salvation of our youth. After all, charity does begin at home, and in the present climate, it is not mixing, but fixing. It's all right to be integrated, desegregated, whatever you want to call it. Marry who you wish, go to school where you want, work where you will. It's all right. But don't forget, our first mission is to our own communities, and that's what should be our objective. This is what should fasten, and this is what should be our obsession for our young people and for the upbuilding of the communities in which our churches are located. So, elder, pastor, Taliaferro, so much for the book. I hope that whets the appetite for elders and members to buy the book. And if you want to buy it, let me know. I will try to work something out for you. Meanwhile, this concludes the overview of the book, and I'm ready for your questions concerning the book or the other ones that you've sent already.
Well, I know that I can be heard. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Elder Rock?
I hear you now. I hear you
Okay,
now.
good.
I hear you now.
Good. Because, man, let me tell you, we have the questions. First, I just want to give a virtual round of applause for the rigorous study that has resulted in this book that I know many people are going to want to get their hands on. Someone else just told me that they're going to get it. And I'm grateful for not only the rigorous study, but for the presentation that you just gave. You went through with rapid speed, I know, so that we could get to the questions, but it was rich and it was deep. Before we even get into the questions, you made mention of the fact that there's a growing trend of Black SDA churches ignoring initiatives relative to spiritual development of youth that requires us to fix them before even worrying about who's mixing with each other. You spoke of Christian education, pathfinders, etc. What it almost sounds like you're saying that Black churches now are starting to become irrelevant to their own Black community and to their own Black context. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
No. The truth of the matter is that the Seventh-day Adventist Church has always had a very conservative approach to the community.
Okay.
And I think that the Black churches today are more and more breaking away from that conservatism. I don't think we've gone far enough, but I think we're breaking away from it. But we've been tethered to a highly conservative social philosophy, which says that what happens in the community is not a part of the gospel commission. I wrote a very high place Adventist authority after the 2015 General Conference and said, I asked him, why is it that the church said nothing, didn't even pray about it, didn't even mention it at the General Conference about those 9 Black Baptists who were killed while they were worshiping by that young man in Charleston? And my answer was, the church was there to discuss finishing the work, not political activities, not social and political activities. And that's one of the things about being in an integrated, desegregated denomination with white leadership for all these decades. We have now more black leadership today. But I think that our Black churches, especially the younger generation, are moving out and they're getting better about that. So I don't mean to say we are regressing. We are progressing, but we are losing our church schools.
Yes.
And we are losing our youth as a result.
Well said. Well, you know, what you made mention about the lack of regard for some of the crying needs brings us to the first question from our first elder, and as much as this is an elders forum, and it speaks of the fact that the church seems so disconnected from the realities of the Black experience, and it cites as an example the tepid response of the church in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, the individual who was killed by the police officer with his knee on his neck. The General Conference sent an edible arrangement to the family as a response to that. And with that being the context, the question that my first elder asked is, how much confidence then should Black members and Black churches have in the leadership of the General Conference, both spiritual and administrative, in the context of that presentation?
Well, to suggest that there can be enthusiasm about the leadership of the church with regard to social activism. I don't think there's a lot of confidence that can be had, because the church is weak in terms of social activism.
Hmm. Well, that begs the question, a follow-up question that I will put in my first elder's mouth, so that if it comes out wrong, I don't have to worry about my retirement. That is this: do we have to take a look then at how our clergy and our church leadership is trained? Is that where that weakness might find its roots?
I think that our clergy, if it's trained in a primarily white environment where it has white leadership, would probably and could understandably come out with a weak social philosophy. But it should not be if they come out of Oakwood, and that's where
Well,
most of them emanate.
Well, Banfield came out of Oakwood. The integrationists that you spoke of when it came to black unions, all of those guys came out of Oakwood.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about black pastors back there.
Okay.
Banfield was president of the Tampa NAACP.
Okay.
And I came out in 52 and I joined the ministerial alliances in Orlando and Miami. And I was a part of, I used to drive, I didn't go into the movies in the early 60s during the civil rights movement. I didn't go into the movies, but I drove the pastors to the movie house and came back and picked them up. that was my righteous regard regarding going to the movies, So
Gotcha.
I was a part of the ministerial. I sat in. I was in the sit-ins in the early 60s. So I'm not saying that the ministers, black ministers, haven't done their part. I'm saying the leadership of the church.
Okay.
And that's a dichotomy.
Let me get to some of the questions that have been listed. And for those of you who are listening and you may wish to pose a question, you can do so on one of our sites. Elder Gordon is waiting to funnel them in this direction. And as we get questions, we will push them in the direction of our guest and our speaker, Dr. Calvin Rock. After this presentation, he is equipped to address any of the questions that we might send in his direction. We go to one now from our youth church, and it says, how should we identify ourselves primarily? By race, or by our religion, or by our own personal identity? What should take priority in self-identification?
Well, I think our personal identity always comes first, and that has to do with who one is in terms of one's family and one's individuality. God would expect that. We are born individuals. We're not born Adventists. And even though we are born into a particular race, it is possible to be black and be brought into or adopted and reared in another race. And it's possible to be born of a mixed ethnic situation where you have black and white. So I think the first identity has to be oneself. You got to be aware of who you are individually. But next, I believe once I become a Christian, my Christianity is the second way I would identify or expect that my decisions would be funneled, or the second pod or ground from which my decisions are funneled would be through my Christian experience. And then very close behind that would be my racial identity.
Got you. Okay. Next question comes from, once again, from one of our young people. And that question is about culture and the buy-in that different black cultures have to the church in general. Is there a difference in the buy-in that West Indian churches, and that's the expression used here, has when it comes to buying into the denominational structure and agenda, African churches, African American churches? Are there differences in the buy-in of these different Black cultures? And if there are differences, what should we do to try to converge them?
Yes, there are differences, and those differences are culturally informed. I don't know how it is now, but when I pastored in my major pastorates in Detroit and New York, at Ephesus and so forth, the West Indian ladies would always wear hats to church.
Hmm.
You know, they wore hats. And the Bible says women should have their heads covered. So a lot of cultures have read the Bible much more realistically, and that's not the right word either, but much more literally.
Okay.
Much more literally. And there are differences in music. You go to a primarily Caribbean church, and I'm proud to be the son of a Barbadian man named George Rock. My father's was from Barbados, and I've got a lot of West Indian relatives in New York and London and other places. So I've been a part of that. My mother was born in the US, of course, but I know there are differences in food, differences in dress, and the longer the family stays, the more adopted the children become. You can't do much with the older folk, but the children become a part of the community and the culture in the land in which they live, and they begin to eat and dress and think a little differently than their parents. And I would not try to change the older ones. Why? Leave it alone. Let them alone. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just that this is the way that they were brought up, and those things persist. And their love for music, their love for dress, their reverence, or what they think is reverence in the church, and how they address the pastor, how they look at authority, in a lot of ways that cultures differ.
Got you. Another question that comes in, and I'll tag on to this question. Have you ever experienced direct racism in the church? And in answering that question, the follow-up question is, how should we address the church's passivity when it comes to addressing racial issues and tensions?
All right. Two different questions. Have I? Yes, I have.
Really?
In 1955, when my wife was bearing our first child, Cheryl, in 1955, the Adventist doctor in Winter Park, Florida, which was one of my churches in that district, the Orlando district, refused to accept her, or told her she could come, but be sure to go in the back door.
Really?
Yeah, 1955, 1 year after Separate but Equal was repealed. And this was a part of that extended gospel expediency I was talking about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
So she refused to do that and prayed and looked in the yellow pages and saw a doctor's name and said she would like to get some natal care and she's black. Do you have a problem? He said no. And we found out that he was a Catholic, and he turned out to be the most wonderful and
we have some clipping that occurred. Your answer was so heated, Dr. Rock, that even the internet decided that it would hold off on delivering it. So I mean, this was in 1955, a direct refusal.
Assistance.
Yeah, a lot of that answer was kind of left to the side due to the system.
Are you there?
I'm here, but we did lose a lot of that answer. We followed you all the way up until you talked about the fact that the doctor refused it, and then your wife found another doctor. You said that that allowed her to.
So Sharon,
Yeah, it's clipping quite a bit on us there. Uh-huh. Yeah, I'm not sure whether or not it's just.
Sharon.
Yeah, I think your missus at this time maybe trying to work on things. Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you, but it is clipping just a little bit. I'm going to see if we can.
Hello.
Can you hear me, sir? Okay, folks. Just a little bit of technical difficulty, as you've already taken note. We have just a few problems, and the unfortunate thing, it was really getting good right about at that point. But Dr. Rock, I'm pretty sure we'll be back as soon as we can reestablish a viable connection that allows us to get a little bit more clarity in his responses. One of the questions I'll share with you, just a few of the questions that are yet to come. Sister Teresa Samuel says that now that we have Black churches and conferences, how do we go about achieving economic justice? Do we have to get money from the government? Where does reparations fit in that? Those are several good questions that we have. Another question asks, what are your thoughts on interracial Adventist churches? Should we be doing more about integrating our congregations, not necessarily our administrative structures, but our congregations? Here's another question that we are waiting to ask, and that is, does the Black Adventist Church demonstrate unfair biases against certain Black cultures? My understanding is that Dr. Rock is back with us now, and if so, we're going to get right to him as soon as we can make a viable connection to our guest, and then we'll get right back to your questions, and hopefully we'll get as many of them to Dr. Rock as much as we can. Folks, this is an absolute privilege for us to be able to do this, to have him spend this Sabbath with us, and I'm grateful for it, and I'm hoping that you are as well. For those of you who know the word of prayer, just keep praying that the technology will not nullify the opportunity for us to get answers from a gentleman who has worked in the vineyard during the heat of the day and who understands this issue better than most. Let's see, but it appears that we got him back, and now we're experiencing some technical difficulties again. But as you all know, we are determined here at West Church, and just as surely as the technology seems to be intent on making sure that we don't get them, we're intent on making sure that we do. So we will continue to keep working on this connection. I don't think we got a response concerning the passivity of the Adventist Church. For those of you who don't know, some of our leading brethren when it comes to media in the Adventist Church, particularly like groups like 3ABN, display a continued and a constant insensitivity, is the best word for me to use, when it comes to the African American milieu. Recently, there was an evangelistic meeting where during the meeting, they were recording the music, but someone was watching the live feed and they noticed that the music wasn't being played on the live feed. And they discovered that 3ABN did not want to share the praise team music with their listening audience because it was, and they did not say that, this is my expression, it was too Black. It was too strong. It was like somebody getting the wrong coffee, too Black and too strong. And so they didn't mind hearing the sermon. Elder Walter Pearson was preaching at the time. They didn't mind hearing the sermon, but they did not want to hear the particular music that they identified with too extreme an element of Black culture. So we'll talk about that question as well. There's a question here that asks, what is the historical posture of the Adventist Church when it comes to issues of racial justice? Is there an actual official position? And if so, how is that position, how is it garnered? How is it created? Who decides what the position is going to be? We'll get to that. Dr. Beverly Gordon, Sister Beverly Gordon, has asked, do we have a responsibility to address social injustice? If our leaders at the General Conference do not believe in this responsibility, what am I to believe regarding the spiritual foundation of my church? Ooh. In other words, if they don't have the sensitivity and the breadth of mind and spirit to address this issue, how can I trust them, or how shall I believe that they have the depth of intellect and character to address issues of spirituality across the board in my church? I'm hoping that we get a chance to ask that question with our guests, because it's too good a question to leave on the sidelines. I'm really looking forward to this question about whether or not Black Seventh-day Adventists are at times biased against certain aspects of Black culture. I don't know if any of you watched the miniseries, the documentary series on PBS entitled The Black Church, where they discussed the creation of certain choirs at colleges like Fisk. And it should be noted, even though they didn't talk about Adventists, the choir at Oakwood College was formed in the very same way that many of these college choirs were formed, or some of these larger choirs like Wings Over Jordan. They were formed to create an atmosphere of Black, quote, acceptability, unquote. In other words, these colleges were designed to sort of dress up Negro spirituals and dress up gospel music from the Black context in such a way that they would be more palatable for the dominant culture's taste and appetites, which is why you have some of these songs kind of being tamed down. A lot of the song, when you would hear some of the anthems, how they would be almost operatic in their presentation. The idea being that by so doing, they would be more acceptable to white culture. So we'll ask that question, and that has become an issue because there are a lot of Black churches. Ebenezer at one point had developed a reputation of being against certain of Black culture, so that and more inclined toward a certain type of music that was, quote, more respectable. I think we might be able to get our guest back again. I'm hoping that we have rescued him from broadband purgatory, and if so, we'll have him back before you, and we'll push these questions in his direction as soon as we have him nearby. Dr. Rock, you're with us again there. Can you hear me, sir? Because for a moment I thought that maybe that doctrine of the rapture was correct, and that God took you and left me. I'm hoping that we have rescued him from and I'm not. I see him speaking, but I'm not hearing him speak. And so we'll have him back before you. Push this question in this direction. And I'm getting.
Can you hear me?
I hear you fine right now, sir.
Can you hear me now?
I hear you. I hear you excellent. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Well, without further ado for myself, let me get to some of the. I'm going to push some of these questions in your direction.
I hear you.
Okay. Excellent. I'm going to get to some of these questions so that while we have you, we can get your answers. And thank you for working so hard to stay with us. This question comes from Sister Teresa Samuel, and it says, now that we have our Black churches and conferences, how do we go about achieving economic justice? Do we really have to get money from the government? And how do reparations fit into this? That's a good question about that reparation.
I can't hear you now, but I see you.
Oh, okay. Well, there's the question on the screen right there for you. Are you able to see that question? And I'm just checking to make sure that I can actually be heard as well.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question on the screen. Okay, I am being heard. So, Dr. Rock, if you can see, do you see that question on the screen?
Right. Then what is your question?
The question is right there on the screen. We have black churches and conferences. How do we go about achieving economic justice? And where do reparations fit into this?
Are you okay?
I don't know.
Ms. Sharon, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but the question is actually printed on the screen, and I'm not sure if Dr. Rock can actually see that question.
You might want to stick around.
Yes. What we, as the movie Cool Hand Luke once expressed, what we have here is a failure to communicate. Okay. I'm going to type it into the chat and see if I can get Sister Rock to convey this question to Dr. Rock. Let's see. Let's see. All right, Miss Sharon, if you can see that question on the screen, and if we can get Dr. Rock to simply respond to that question. And I see that he is actually muted. Now he's unmuted. Okay, Dr. Rock, can you see it there? And I think we have a frozen president again. Ah, yes. Well, life in the fast lane sometimes does not go the way that we want it to. Let's see. That's every once in a while. Let me see if I can decrease the lighting here, because I am not quite that light. I'm starting to look like Andy Young here. Well, I tell you what we'll do. We're going to switch and have a bit of music for just a moment. See if we can work on this and try to ransom and salvage the rest of this program. Let's play a little music that reminds us of the month that we are celebrating on this final weekend of Black History Month, and then we'll come back to you.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the lifting skies. Let it resound, let it resound in sweet. God of our ears, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path we crave. Oh, that's a peace. Oh, God, where we
Well, wait a minute. I see someone that I'm very familiar with, Dr. Rock. Let's try removing your mute and see if we're back. Are you able to hear me?
It's ending now, so he should be on mute in a few seconds.
Okay. Well, I see Dr. Rock, but I'm not sure if he can hear me at this point. And I sense that at this juncture, I think that we got through service with the best of efforts and with a sincere hope, but I'm not sure if we're going to make it.
I hear you.
Oh, you can hear
Do
me
you
now.
hear me?
I can hear you now.
Do you hear me?
I do hear you. Do you hear me, sir? Uh-huh. We're having
I
some
am
difficulty
talking,
with the.
but I don't know.
Yeah, I sense. Is it delayed?
My mouth is.
Yeah. Well, see, now what this says to me, Elder Rock,
I hear you.
You can hear me.
I hear you. You don't hear me.
Oh, I hear you, but I think that there's a delay.
I hear you.
I'm not sure if I know that I'm being we're having some challenges, but this is what this means, Dr. Rock. This is God's way of letting us know that you have to come back and that you've got to spend time with us here at the West Philadelphia Church for another Sabbath, and I am more than willing to have that happen. So what we'll do now is extend our heartfelt and our deepest thanks for your preparation and for your willingness to spend this time with us, and let you know how much we have appreciated what you have shared and what you have done, not only today, but your contribution over the years to our church and to the institutions of our church, particularly Oakwood University. And what I'll do is I'll catch up with you, and we will make plans to have a continuation of this forum in the very, very near future. For those of you who are joining, we do apologize for the technical difficulties. These are things that cannot be helped. We do our best to try to bring to you the clearest and the most consistent and refined transmission of information that we possibly can, but sometimes There's only so much that we can do, and this is one of those times. We were glad that we were able to get through our Sabbath service, such as it was, and to get through the presentation that Dr. Rock shared with us earlier in this program, but there are limitations to everything. The history of Black people in this country is well documented and well known. The history of Black people in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, not so much. We'll continue to study it, to research it, to look at it, and to find ways to enhance the position of the members of this church who happen to be descendants, proud descendants of the continent of Africa, no matter where they might be found. And we will try to do so in such a way that edifies the church and that will build up our congregations and that will glorify God. We don't wish to separate for purposes of simple separation. What we want to do is try to find more efficient ways of operation. With that being said, folks, we are hoping that as the sun sets, that God has given rest to your soul and your body, refreshment to your mind and your spirit, and that as you face the ending of this week and prepare for the week that is to come, that you might find yourself living in the presence of God and feeling the presence of His Spirit in your own life. Let us look to God now as we close out this service, and then we will be dismissed. Let us pray. Father in heaven, we recognize that the plans of men are just that. They are plans, they are hopes, they are dreams, but we know that your word never returns to you void. And we thank you for that which we have been able to share this day. And more importantly, we thank you that we've been able to come together on this day to be a part of the family of God in fellowship and study in association with one another. May those things that have been discussed edify body, soul, and spirit. We ask your blessing upon your servant, Dr. Calvin Rock, upon his wife, Ms. Sharon, that you would continue to bless them with good health and with prosperity and with joy in their hearts and in their minds. And now for the people of God who are a part of this family, we pray that you would keep us together in the hollow of your hand and maintain the bond of peace between us. In the name of the living Christ, we pray. Let all of God's children say, amen and amen. God bless you, folks, and thank you for joining us. And as Black History Month ends and as Women's History Month begins, we pray that we might continue to march together in peace. I'll see you again right here in virtual service real soon.